watching this episode of the Gautrain While It Matters, and today's episode is on the future of rapid rail in Gauteng and why it matters to extend the rapid rail system. My name is Godfrey Mutizwa. My guest today is Dr Mathetha Mokonyama, Impact Area Manager for Transport Systems and Operations at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I think in terms of people who want this system to succeed, there's no number better to illustrate it than the number that shows the total satisfaction of those who use it. And the number that I saw is 87%. So it's no argument to say we want it extended. But let's begin at the start and talk about the sustainability of this system. Some people have suggested that we could have gone the rapid bus route and it would have been cheaper and it would have been as efficient. You study these things for a living. Tell us, is it sustainable the way we've done it so far?
All right. Thank you very much for having me on your program. Yes, definitely we study, transport systems and operations, like you said, for a living, Godfrey. Very important is that we need to use the right measures all the time in science. For example, if you are going to say, I'm on a weight loss program, I'm going to be losing weight. If you're going to be measuring your height as you're trying to lose weight, you're not going to be very successful at that. So what we're trying to do all the time is to come up with appropriate measures. And if you really want to measure the sustainability of a system, transport system, there are 5 dimensions that we often want to look at. The one dimension is around ecological sustainability.
Right.
For example, intergenerational equity, intragenerational equity, in addition to of course, financial viability. Financial viability is just one of the measures. I mean, if you look at, for example, the issues of ecological sustainability, we've got a target that we say we need to work towards. Yeah. That is around 5.6 kilowatt hour per capita per day. And currently in Gauteng, we are around 14. So we are consuming a lot more energy per capita in the transport system than we should. And to overcome that, we need to inject capital to address the backlog that we have. So right measures to measure sustainability.
Sure. So you used many other words there that I want to get a handle on. You talk about the ecological impact. I think I want to understand what that is, and I want to understand how it relates to the Gautrain. Okay.
Some time ago, we did a study with Gauteng and Department of Environmental Affairs at the time, to measure what impact Gautrain has had in terms of reducing, carbon footprint. And we estimated that, from a base year from 2015 to about, forecasted to about 2037, over a 17-year period, that Gautrain would reduce something like 4.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's about a power station in a year, for example.
Sure.
Emissions. So the measure on ecological sustainability essentially says what you take out of the natural resources must not be more than what is available. So if you are consuming a lot more energy, a lot more space out of the system, then it is not sustainable. So you're actually affecting future generations.
Right.
So the better measures need to be put in place to look at the sustainability of transport systems. Gautrain being a packet, being part of the basket of measures in that system.
Absolutely. So I want to come back at the end of it all and ask you the question, and I think I want you to think about it now. I want to know net where we are in terms of those measures that you have to measure the sustainability of the system. But let's talk about the financial aspect of it. Obviously, this is one that is closest to us as consumers. How far are we on that front?
Well, consumers often look at what it means for pockets.
Yes.
Based on the measurements that we have taken, on average, when someone is using Gautrain as opposed to using a car, they save on average about 20%. Unless, of course, you're going to the airport, which is relatively more expensive, especially if you are closer to the airport. But generally, you're saving about 20% of car costs. If you include things like insurance, of course, depreciation, and everything that, the total cost of running a car. So you're saving about 20%. But the bigger question is around the cost to the economy, right? Right now, we're paying 5% more of GDP than we should on transport. So that is actually our backlog. We're paying equivalent of 5% of GDP on transport as society, right? To move. So if you're saying, how do I eradicate that backlog? You need to, inject capital to be able to, remove that backlog. So it's a massive backlog that we have.
Right. Which is an opportunity if you look at it on the other hand. But I wanted to go back to the power consumption that you spoke about at the beginning. I want to get my head around what you're explaining there in terms of how the Gautrain has been able to perhaps further on better or more efficient usage of power there. Are you saying we're better off with the Gautrain, or there's still potential to use the Gautrain better in terms of our overall count on power consumption?
Well, if you take a system like Gautrain, right, in terms of per passenger consumption, energy consumption, you're looking at about 1 to 2 kilowatt hour per passenger trip, for a single trip. If you're looking at a car, you're looking at about 14 thereabout. So it's a massive gap. So if you were to reduce that gap, for cars, you have to electrify quite substantially. So, a system like Gautrain, rail in general, with high capacity, and if it's used for what is meant to be used for, you are going to then reduce your energy consumption quite drastically.
Absolutely. What about compared to a bus? You use the passenger car and the train here. Have you done some numbers for the bus?
Yes. I mean, for bus, depending on the capacity, and if it's used for what is meant for, say 65, 80 seat, bus, you're talking about 3 kilowatt hour per capita, or per passenger, let me say, per passenger trip. So that as well does reduce energy consumption quite dramatically.
Yeah.
But one problem that we have in South Africa, something that we need to address, is around the off-peak demand. You may supply in the peak, of course. We use the system for what they were designed for. Yeah. We sell every seat, but in the off-peak, we tend to have a lot of the fleet that is running empty. So that is not sustainable. So we need to address that problem going forward.
Absolutely. And we also need to make sure that we are back to level 0 as soon as possible, because we want those trains to be full, because as you clearly demonstrate, there's a greater advantage here. The other measures that the government uses, and I saw this number when I was doing research for our interview, is that the benefit to society apparently sits at 74 Rand for every trip that is taken on the Gautrain, in the form of reduced traffic, accidents on the roads, time saving, and lower CO2 emissions. That sounds like quite a package and a big advantage to move to the Gautrain.
Well, it is mass transport in general. We have recently, together with the city of Johannesburg, I think on the 3rd of September, the mayoral committee approved something that I think is seminal, is investing on the basis of total social costs. So we essentially estimated a network, or came up with a network that, if implemented, would result in society paying the least to implement that network from a total social cost perspective. And rightly, like you said, you want to include in there, things like crashes, travel time, and other things, the risks associated with road versus rail and so forth. So you need to include all those things if you're going to look at the costing of a system. So going forward, we need to do that in all the other cities, invest on the basis of total social cost, as opposed to just, accounting, the rand and cents like accountants would typically do.
Yeah, that's interesting because I see one of the things that the Gautrain is bringing is, if you like, togetherness or the integration between Johannesburg and Pretoria. And they talk about an increase, obviously, in the number of people who are using the service, but there's also the issue of more people who are moving between the two cities and integrating the two cities. I want to talk about the advantages of that. Where do we accrue the benefits of that integration that is happening between communities? Because I'm imagining if we can do it right here in Johannesburg and Pretoria, you could take the same model and perhaps extend it to Cape Town and other urban environs, and perhaps to Durban, etc., etc.
Well, I think that the bigger problem here is population, right? Gauteng adds in the region of 300,000 people every year recently. Similarly, Western Cape has got quite a lot of people, coming in. So, I mean, if you're adding 300,000, population of 300,000 people every year into the region, you need to provide the seats. You need to provide capacity. Now, if you're not adding capacity, you're creating problems. It becomes more and more expensive to move around. Labor becomes a lot more expensive. In fact, labor is an input cost to everything that we do. So you need to provide capacity. So now per unit of kilometer, so say per unit of output, a rail system would typically provide a lot more capacity than single vehicles, smaller, lower capacity vehicles.
Yeah.
What we see, of course, is that there's a lot of growth in lower capacity, modes of transport, cars, but also minibus taxis. I think about 90% of the seats, that's the seats that we have, are provided by lower capacity modes, which is not sustainable in the longer term. So we need to increase the capacity of higher capacity, modes in our networks to absorb that kind of, demand.
So in the morning I was arguing with my wife and I was saying, imagine if there were no taxis on the roads, how peaceful it would be, and also, we could move faster and there would be less accidents, etc., etc. Please don't quote me, but I certainly see the benefits here. Now the government is talking about adding another 150 kilometers of rail and a further 19 stations on this system. So we would then link would link Sandton with Randburg as well as Cosmos City, and then on to Soweto. Does it follow that with that additional capacity, we would be using our power even more efficiently if we ramp up the numbers and when those systems do come online?
Yes, well, what we need to be doing is not to look at these projects in isolation, right? Gautrain is a transport project, but we need to look at the built environment in general. There's proposals, for example, in Tshwane to build some 50,000 units in the east, in isolation. So you want to have those kinds of programs being integrated with the broader network, projects, so that when you say, I'm going to build these 50,000 units of human settlements, they are built together with the transport system. The human settlements, department with low-income housing. You can create more benefits out of creating, livable environments around, rail stations.
Yeah.
So the key there is not to just do these, projects in isolation. They should be part of the broader built environment program. But definitely, in terms of the expansion, program, the links, the extra links that we've seen out of the modeling that we did, definitely, Soweto going to, Roodepoort, Roodepoort, linking to Sandton, but then also Roodepoort linking to the CBD of Johannesburg. Those are very important links that
Yes.
you see going into the future. And of course, it's got to be mass transport as a whole. So, for example, there's a rail line between Roodepoort and the Johannesburg CBD that is existing. You want that, to be active, to work properly, so that when you introduce other systems, they are mutually, reinforcing. It's not just one line in isolation of the others.
Yeah. Are we beginning to see the benefits that the government touted, including, of course, the provincial government, that it touted when this system was being promoted? And I remember at the time they were talking about the creation of greater employment and also giving commuters transport choices, real estate developments that were supposed to come on board. Then we spoke about the regional integration side of it. But the other aspect was foreign direct investment coming in. I want to talk a little bit about what we have seen as evidence following the introduction of the Gautrain in 2010.
Well, evidence does point to the property vacancy rates improving around the stations. There's a lot more investment, taking place around the stations, which is in line with what was, essentially envisaged. But quite important is that once you build capacity, mass transport capacity, the built environment will definitely respond to that. So we're seeing that, happening. We'd like to see that more of that happening in areas like Alexandra. We'd like to see that happening in other nodes that are a bit more depressed. So that definitely would help to uplift, those, localized economies, and not just to support only the likes of Sandton.
Yeah.
And there is definitely potential in that regard.
Yeah. In my introductory remarks, I spoke about some people suggesting that perhaps there were better ways of having done this. And one of the aspects I touched on was the issue of how to finance these very big projects. We know that the government is introducing what it calls the Sustainable Infrastructure Development System, SIDS methodology, and this is being pursued now. And I would imagine the Gautrain falls into that. Let's talk about those financing methodologies. Did we get the Gautrain right first? And then secondly, are there areas to tweak as we talk about the second phase as well as the third phase of the project?
Yeah, well, earlier in the earlier developments, there were proposals to have, bus lanes, along the highways in place of a rail system. If you're looking just at, financial viability, you can come to those conclusions, but you need to look at the total social cost to society. What is the total social cost of that program, that project? You need to, evaluate projects from that perspective. Now, if you're just looking at financial, viability, how much money you have, in the short term, you will come to those conclusions. You need to, for the kind of demand that we have, you need to create sufficient capacity to reduce the total social costs in a region. Now, in terms of financing of programs, last week the cabinet resolved to establish the Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Committee.
Right.
Now, that is very promising, because then that on the agenda is then how do we give effect to the promises that we've made as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I mean, South Africa has got massive, targets. We want to, by 2050, to reduce our, emissions by something like 300 million tons CO2 equivalent.
Sure.
That is massive, from a base of about 530.
Absolutely. Wow. It appears like our technology is failing us, but we were coming to an end in any case. Dr. Mathetha Mokonyama is Impact Area Manager for Transport Systems and Operations at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. I think I felt like I was back in class, getting educated, and there's much more to stepping through those doors at Santo Noreta or our international airport. Thank you very much indeed for watching this edition of the Gautrain While It Matters. Until next time, goodbye.